Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show today, where we're continuing the SQL databases in Fabric Learn Together series. I'm Heini Ilmarinen. I am from Finland and a data platform MVP. And today I am joined here by Mihail. How are you doing?
Perfect. I'm very happy to be here and to have this presentation. My name is Mihail Matev. I'm data platform and AI MVP from Sofia, Bulgaria. And we will talk today about how to have GraphQL endpoints in Microsoft Fabric.
And I'm really excited for this session because it is quite an interesting capability to have in something we have maybe thought of more like an analytical platform. Great evolution. So what we're looking for,
yeah, please
exactly. What we want from today's show is we want to keep this live and interactive. So you have a chance to write your messages in the chat. And we actually have Buck Woody as the moderator today. So it could be that your question gets picked up in the chat already, or some of those questions could come all the way here to the stream as well for us to answer. So make sure to say hi. We see already a lot of activity in the chat. So that's really great to see. This is actually already the fourth session in this series of Learn Together for SQL Database in Microsoft Fabric. So if you haven't caught the earlier shows, they are also available to watch on demand. So you can go back and see some of them if you've missed any. And of course, today we are in the fourth session of figuring out how to use GraphQL within Fabric together with SQL databases. So that is where we're taking this next step. And the demos you will see today will be kind of building on top of the ones that have been shown on the previous sessions as well. And we also have you a kind of a way to here also to check out the FabCon 25 in Vegas. The registration is open and there are also workshops there. So if you're really looking to learn about Fabric, it's a great opportunity to do so and really focus on this particular topic. What are your thoughts, Mihail?
It will be really interesting area because especially GraphQL is more dev side expertise, but from another hand, it is very important for data analytics. So I really have a lot of interesting challenges in my experience related to GraphQL. Now I think Microsoft Fabric offers to make GraphQL endpoints pretty easy and to make amazing, easy, and very productive creation of GraphQL endpoints. I think everyone related to data will enjoy because for few minutes you can have amazing GraphQL server and everything in context of Microsoft Fabric.
That is great. And for FabCon specifically, there is also a discount code for $150. So that is also shared in the comments. It might be easier to copy from there, but the code is MSCUST. And if you use that when you register, then you're able to get a nice discount to go to this event as well. All right, with that, I think we've gotten all the preparation underway, and that means that we are able to move on to the content of today. So in the previous sessions, we've of course been talking about SQL databases on Fabric. That is the whole topic of these sessions. So all of this will link on that. And so in the previous sessions, we've been, for example, building some stored procedures that then do vector searches on that data and also leverage AI on the way. And today we will continue to build on that. We will look at how you could then use GraphQL in Fabric to bring that API layer on top of that you could then leverage to call from your application code. So we will kind of be covering the theory of GraphQL and what you need to know about it to be able to use it, but we will also have demos kind of building up to this scenario as well. So we'll kind of actually start from a bit of hands-on here in the beginning. So in this first part, we are actually in the SQL database in Fabric and creating a stored procedure where we are setting some variables in the beginning. How many items do we want to return, and how similar do we want those items that we are fetching to be to each other? And so we are trying to find similar speakers by using vector search and finding speakers that are kind of scored close to each other, as well as finding sessions that are equivalent to some search word that we are putting in to our query. And all this logic is here, so we're not going to go through each of those rows specifically. If you want to understand more specifically how the vector search works, go back to the previous episode. There was a lot of good detail and information about that there. So you can always go back there and look at the details. So with all the logic in place, then what we want to do is return a specific amount of sessions. We had 10 specified at the top, and just returning specific columns that we would like, the speaker, title, abstract, and things like that are relevant to us. And then kind of once we get to the end of this, we of course want to create that stored procedure for us so we can call it from our SQL queries. So then we're going here to create our new SQL query and executing that specific procedure for us and giving it in some text that we want to search by. So that word could be pretty much anything. We are basically searching session abstract and trying to find here sessions that somehow relate to technology. And here we have to remember it's not specifically that the abstract maybe contains the word technology, but it is somehow related to technology in some way. And of course, we're able to use any word that we like here to find the sessions. Of course, it depends on the word, how many sessions we will find. And so for sessions by community and youth as well. And we can see some of the titles here, how we can see some of them are maybe more related to community and some are more related to youth and so forth. So we get this list of the most kind of related topics that can be found from there. So with that, let's kind of then go into how could we then bring an API layer on top of that. And what we're using on the Fabric side would be GraphQL and using that to bring that API capability. So let's start from some basics to understand what GraphQL is. It is maybe something that you might not have come across yet. It is already used in places, but we might be more familiar with REST APIs, for example, or something like that in our work. So it is kind of a new mindset that we need to get into. So with GraphQL, what we could be using it for is that we can query and mutate data. So we can have our data stored in some kind of data service. It could be a relational database, an NoSQL database, or so forth. And one of the options that we could use is that we could actually use this project that has been built, an open source project, Data API Builder, and we could use that to use GraphQL to query and mutate our data. And we'll learn a little bit more about what does querying and mutations mean in this context. So we are able to use almost any database service behind the scenes to store our data. In this context, we are, of course, talking about a SQL database, and that is our main focus today. But it could be some other kind of database behind the scenes as well. As an API layer, we could have the GraphQL APIs managed in Azure API Management and have that as the gateway through which our API queries go in. And of course, if we needed to host our APIs in Azure, for example, then we can use the different hosting services that we have available in Azure. So we could use a static web app if we have a static site. If we need more of a server or a full stack platform to use, then we can use Azure App Service or Azure Container Apps if your application is containerized, or for serverless, we could go with Azure Functions. And then, of course, we need some kind of authentication in our solution as well. So we need some kind of identity platform. And if you're in the Fabric and Azure world, then Entra ID would be the one to use. But if we were kind of building an application from scratch that uses GraphQL, we would need to ensure that we handle the hosting part. We would need to ensure that we handle the API layer, and then we have the actual data stored somewhere. So there is a lot of components at play. And that is actually what also this solution is Fabric is trying to tackle and make it easier for us to actually create this API for the data that we want to serve for our application. So how does a GraphQL work? GraphQL works so that there is a GraphQL server, and then you are able to define a GraphQL API. And that GraphQL API communicates with a GraphQL server, and then that communicates behind the scenes to the different supported data services that we could use as the backend for our API. And the benefits are, of course, that with GraphQL, we have kind of a unified way to define our APIs. And the GraphQL server is what then takes care of the communication between the API and the data source itself. So we don't have to build that logic by ourselves to make that happen. And I went the wrong way. And of course, we always want to use that API from some kind of application. We want to leverage it for our needs. So how we call it is we have this query or mutation is in JSON form, and we call that API with it. We'll see some samples later today. And then we get the response back, which is again in standard JSON format, so that we can then process that in the correct way for us. So GraphQL really makes it easier to kind of handle that communication with the data source that we are using behind the scenes. And with that, we get to the basic concepts that we have within GraphQL, and I will hand it over to Michael.
Thank you. Here, I will try to explain a little more from one side mechanics, why we need to use GraphQL, and what exactly stay behind the stage. As you saw from the previous slide and explanation from the beginning, we have a different structure of our application and data flow, and the main reason is to make this communication between client and server simpler, more accurate, more optimized, to not need to have many requests. Doesn't matter if we have a RESTful HTTP request, or we are working on the level where we have a request against the API of specific database. Usually, we have several requests against the database or exposed API to get objects that we need and to have some transformations. And there is the conceptual case why we need to do that and to have all this logic between different layers in our applications. We can put it in the backend where is our data layer, and to put in front server that will make these requests against data sources and construct the whole object with complexity that will be sent back to the client. In this way, we will save actually bandwidth, we will have less traffic, we will have less requests, our overall solution will stay a little or more simple and easy to be managed. The main case in the past was that existing solutions with GraphQL required two possible approaches. One is to have custom implementation of GraphQL server. Usually that means developers need together with data platform experts to have collaboration and to implement this service, or to use some third-party service like, for example, Apple server or Express GraphQL, separate products that can do this for you, but they need to be configured. And in general, we need to manage the infrastructure from the backend where we have different data sources and this server. Of course, this needs some effort, some timeline to be implemented, and sometimes it's easy to start just with direct request against databases. But we are coming to Microsoft Fabric where you can have this with several clicks. That means we have no need to make separately our GraphQL server. We have no need even to configure something because it is in Microsoft Fabric. That is the reason to have so much content related to GraphQL. And when we have GraphQL, we need, of course, to configure it, at least on the level of data structure. For this reason, we have GraphQL schema. GraphQL schema can be managed easy. You will see later in this session. We need to have um, several types of objects that will be configured in this schema. We need to have data types that represent main data structures in our GraphQL. We will have also objects that represent instances of these types, and we will have fields in the same way like when we are talking about objects in programming, but here is mostly about entities and data. So we have the same approach. Usually the start is pretty easy because when we create the API endpoint, we have already default schema and we can modify it. We can make some updates to adjust our data structure to what we need exactly for specific business logic. We will be able also to have additional configuration related to queries and mutations that we will manage a little later. So we can go through the next slides where we will discuss a little about how to create API. Um, Types, queries, and mutations were already explained from the previous slide. So Heidi, I will ask you just to go ahead. Okay. Comparison between GraphQL and SQL is good to be clarified because when we have SQL, actually we have simple standard language that is used to have simple queries and management of data. But you can imagine that our data is in one store and it is disassembled. And we arrange this data into different places. And we need to get these parts and to construct on application the logic where we will construct exact objects that we need. The key difference when we are using GraphQL is that we store already construct objects. We can get everything that we need, like object with complete structure, with everything that we need inside it. And we have no need to think about how it is stored in database. This is the main advantage. We have simplification when we are designing and implementing business logic in different solutions. So in equal conditions, usually GraphQL can simplify the rest of the work if we have already GraphQL server implemented. And here comes the main benefit to have this feature also in Microsoft Fabric. GraphQL endpoint with several clicks. So let's see now how we will make this. GraphQL endpoint can be created in Microsoft Fabric. For example, if you choose data engineering and if you choose after that add feature and go to developer data. Developer data, because mostly GraphQL is considered like specific type of data that in the past was managed with custom implementation of the server. So we can create this kind of endpoint, and immediately we will be asked to get data. So we can connect to specific data, and default schema will be generated automatically. So we will have opportunity to add one or more data sources. This default schema will be already generated, and we can after that polish this data structure, making small changes, allowing some activities, and also manage relationships. Relationships can be added additionally into a GraphQL service. You can add relationships between entities in similar way like you have such kind of relationships in databases like SQL database. But here you configure these relationships on configuration level in GraphQL API service. So this is the simple way how we can start with GraphQL API endpoint. We will talk during the next slides how we will use it.
Yes, because of course, once we have the API created, we want to then most likely query the data. We, of course, then have often needs to insert in, and we'll get to that at one point, but let's start from the querying side. And here we can actually see first kind of a comparison of what does a SQL query and what does a GraphQL query look like. For example, we often use when we're working with SQL, we use some select statements where we are either selecting everything from a table or specifying certain columns that we choose. And that is kind of one of the most commonly used things that we might use on the SQL database side. Very similarly, on the GraphQL side, we have queries that are used to retrieve the data from our API. The syntax is different, and we are using JSON to specify our query. So we have this query structure, and then within that we have our table name, and then we have our columns that we are retrieving. So we are kind of able to then specify the structure of the data that we want to receive very kind of clearly and to the detail that we need, so that we can then limit the amount of data that we might require. So the GraphQL query is used to retrieve data from an API. Of course, the syntax is different than for a SQL, but we are able to specify fields and arguments that we might need to kind of put in to specify that query in a meaningful way for us. And of course, when we talk about queries, then a lot of times we also have a requirement to filter the data as well. Normally, we don't just take everything. This is one of the very common use cases that we might have. In the SQL side of the world, we would use the where clause to do the filtering and then specify a requirement that needs to be fulfilled to get a specific subset of data. In GraphQL, we have a specific syntax in which we would do that as well. So we have the same query structure we had just for a simple query. And then kind of when we specify the table, then we are able to add in this filter argument in this case, and then give kind of what are we searching for. So we have these specifications of how do you specify that, hey, this needs to be equal. We use the EQ abbreviation for that. And of course, we can also specify ands and ors and so forth to make more complex requirements be fulfilled as well within these filtering arguments that we might have in place. So we can likewise in the GraphQL side, we can specify very clearly what do we need of the data using the different specifications that we have available. Again, if you're coming from the SQL world, it might take a little bit of time to figure out what is the correct syntax, which order do I put things. But in essence, there are very similar structures in place that you can use. So the fields and arguments are very essential components for a GraphQL query, because then we are able to specify even more clearly what data do we need. And the fields are specifying what data are requested. So that is the list of fields that we had in the query. And then arguments are giving additional parameters to the filter or are enabling us to sort the data. So those are kind of two different concepts that we have for GraphQL queries. So what we also might use for filtering in GraphQL is that we might use arguments. So for example, we might use arguments to fulfill a specific conditions. We can use them in query fields or query parameters or kind of a directive argument. We have some samples of these in the demo as well, but not for all of them. And then we can, for example, find data based on a date range. If we want data for a specific user ID or for a specific location, those we are able to then specify there. And we will get to mutation in a little bit, but we can also use the arguments to filter data in a mutation just as we can use them in a query as well. And lastly, we are able to combine multiple conditions to filter the data. And this is, of course, when we need to have multiple criteria that we need to fulfill. And then we would combine and or operators to ensure that we get the right data out. So any skills that you have in regards already in this area, they translate very well to the GraphQL side as well. It is more of a matter of figuring out this new syntax that we need to use. And with that, we get to the kind of the next use case that we might have ahead of inserting and updating data.
This is one very essential functionality for any data service. So we will discuss now about how to change our data, how we can add data, how we can update data, and actually also we can delete data using GraphQL. The most important abstraction here is mutation. So we can go to the next slide. And when we talk about mutation, it is actually a representation of different types of changes that we can have in GraphQL server. We can have insert, we can have update, you can have delete, but everything related to these operations here is in the context of mutation. Usually the approach is not very different than from standard SQL databases. So we need to have a request where we will explain what kind of object, what exact instance of object we will change, and there could be description of specific changes. Additionally, we can also have flexibility to return from this kind of mutation different data. By default, it is the updated object, but it is something that it is not limited from GraphQL. So we have the whole flexibility for specific purposes to change our mutations and to be possible to make update, delete, insert, having different set of parameters, and of course to return specific data. We will go now on the next slide, where conceptually we'll see again the main types of mutations: insert, update and delete mutations. They are also described in the schema. You are able to manage permissions if it is possible to make updates on your data, or this data will be, for example, only read only. So on the level of GraphQL server and configuration of the schema, we can control this. Now let's go to the next slide and to see the comparison between SQL query, where we have, for example, here insert, and one mutation where we are adding object into our data. As you see, we are describing data in the way that is needed for the business logic. That means we are using object country, we are adding fields with specific values that are important for our business logic, and we don't need to think about how this information will be persist in different data sources. This is implemented on a level of configuration of our GraphQL server, and in this way we have simplification of our work, and the focus is mostly on the business logic and main context related to the application. We can go now on the next slide, and we will see one specific things related to modification. So mutations by default are part of our schema. We will be able to update it, to make some changes, and to adapt the schema regarding to the exact needs of our application. And we will be able also to have variables that will be used in a similar way, like for searching with filtering, for changing the context when we have the same operations. So I think that we have later in the videos some samples related to this, but usually parameters that are used to pass data for specific mutations are realized also like variables, and we can make this flexibility to execute these mutations many times with different dynamic data. So let's go to the next. Dealing with responses. When we talk about mutations, we have again response. Response that can be similar to what we have when we query data, but depends on our configuration. As I already explained, by default, the response is the updated object. You can control it. You can redefine the mutation design and data structure, and depending on the logic, you can make returned just part of the data or ID or something different. I think on the next slide we have representation of the object that can be returned, and again it is something that is not strictly defined in GraphQL. You have the whole flexibility to design your mutations in the most convenient way for your business logic. When we talk about variables, variables are very flexible in the context of GraphQL. I already mentioned several times that variables are used for parameters, but not only. Here you see the sample with insert, where object that is passed like parameters actually can be realized like variable. Almost all mutations follow the best practices to use parameters, and these parameters is better to be used also having variables. Let's now see the other samples from the next slides. Here is update mutation, where we have the similar scenario, and you see that in the returning part you can have also a specific subset of data that is returned. And we can see how we can send also query with variables. That means you are able also to send structure with variables and query to be executed for all these variables. Here we have also one interesting scenario, bulk mutation, when we have, for example, operations that need to be executed several times for a list of objects with the same type. We are able to implement bulk mutation. It is like a batch operation where we can define objects that will be affected and to execute all these like one request. So after that, our application will be not loaded with additional specific logic. We will have everything on the GraphQL server and request responses between GraphQL server and databases. In this way, we simplify all the rest layers of the application. So that's the most important related to handling of the responses. You can see on the next slide one sample with JavaScript, where we have request and response having endpoint for GraphQL. You can have the same logic using Microsoft Fabric GraphQL endpoint, or if you have another GraphQL server, again, GraphQL is not dependent on the platform where GraphQL server is implemented. Everything is up to configuration, and you have actually technology agnostic structure of your data. So you are able to have migrations from solutions that are from different vendors, from different technologies, to Microsoft Fabric, to simplify the overall solution and to keep all this logic related to requests and response the same for the other layers of your solution.
That's really great. And now we kind of get to see some of this in practice, which will make it possibly a little easier to grasp. And I just saw in the chat as well that there was some link posted to a kind of a walkthrough tutorial that you can do if you want to test the GraphQL for yourself, because of course, if you get hands-on experience, it's much easier than to digest the topic in itself. So since we started from the SQL side in the beginning with the video, we will add one more layer of kind of a wrapper to it, and then we will go on to how do you then create the GraphQL side in Fabric, and then also a very simple sample of the application code as well. So what we will be doing here is we will be just be creating kind of a wrapper for the find session stored procedure. As you can see, it is very, very simple. It is basically just calling the find sessions procedure itself and just specifying which fields does it want returned. So if we then kind of go and test this out after running it, we can kind of test the previous implementation, and then this wrapper that we just created, we can execute the find sessions procedure and see the results for that and kind of figure out what was happening there. And then we can also add the execution of this wrapper that we just created, and then query it with the same search word and see what happens. And we can run then those both either separately or just run them at one go, both of those. And then we are able to actually move between the different result sets and compare what is the difference there. So here is the first one, and then we can go to the second one there, and we can see that the result sets are very, very similar. They look exactly the same. So that's pretty much what we wanted to do here, is we just wanted to create a wrapper that we're going to use. Then we will proceed to creating the GraphQL resource itself. So you can go to new item and search for GraphQL, and you will find this preview capability for it that we can use. Give it a name, and then click create after that. Get the name in there, yes, and create. And when we create a GraphQL, we are right away kind of directed to, well, we don't have anything until we select the data source. And we have two different modes for authentication that we can use. We can use either SSO, or we can give kind of stored credentials that it's going to use. And when we choose the data source, we can select database. And so we are going to our stored procedure this time. We're not going to a table. We are going to a stored procedure, the find sessions wrapper that we just created, and using that as a base for our GraphQL API that we are creating here. So we start by creating a query here. Remember, this can be what we can use to fetch the data. In this case, it is a little different since we are using the stored procedure. So we're giving the name of the stored procedure, and then this nicely gives you kind of all the fields that are available through there, and you can pick and choose which ones you are going to use and you want to fetch. So it makes the authoring experience quite easy for you, because it is able to look into what kind of data do you have available from there. And we are then able to also pass that variable that we can call that stored procedure for. We can pass it in as one of the kind of a variable there after the name. So we can see that we are actually able to return the title, abstract, and speaker for that session. In this case, it was Oliver that we were searching for, and here we are testing it with Europe. And we can kind of then check our return values here again. So we can see Europe mentioned in the abstracts there if we look at the output. The nice thing on the GraphQL side as well is that we have also this generate code option. So it gives us a base point to start from building our application that would call this. So we can just go in there and copy the code, get it into our environment. Here we are just doing this locally at this point. And it also kind of grabs our query that we created there and pulls it into our code and creates this function for fetching the data, that since we had a query in place for fetching the data in place as well. So it makes also the coding experience quite easy for us. It brings a lot of these structures into place that we might have had to create by ourselves. So we are just going here into our folder where we have our code, initializing that and giving some inputs here, and we will just let that roll through. And here we are seeing that, yes, everything is okay for it, where we see the versions that are being used, for example, for the Azure identity and so forth. And here we're listing the different directories and things like that. We'll go ahead and add this Azure identity portion. So ensuring that we have that imported and we're available for us to use it. We didn't have that available. And that was actually already up to date. And it kind of also checks through the different packages that we are using in this case as well. So we will then go in and see kind of at some of the other files that are included, and we can see kind of it has this script for how do you start the application. You run the node find sessions MJS file, and that gets the application running for us. So we can then actually, if we would want to kind of run that manually, we are able to just run the app from the command prompt by using this. So we can see that if we just say npm run app, it uses that command from our configuration file that was specified. And yes, we can actually see some data from there as well. We can see that in our query, in this case, we had the Europe search word, so it used that at this point. But of course, we could have like a parameter that can be passed from the application as well, if that was what we wanted to do. So since the result wasn't very beautiful for us, we can do some more adjustments on that, and also limit how many results we want back. And then we will come to this point of kind of adjusting our code a little bit and giving that option to actually prompt for input from the user, because we probably don't want that search word to be just hard-coded. We actually want to be able to pass in some value. So we're just getting some lines in here that we're going to use. We're going to ask for a prompt that asks what kind of session are you looking for, and then we are going to pass that value to our query. So that way we are able to dynamically ask it in our application and pass it on to the GraphQL API. So there are our changes in that we needed to do. And now if we kind of close that and run our application again, we are adding the prompt sync first, as we did with the identity package as well, and then running the app the same way. So now we can see the prompt for what are we actually looking for. We are able to put in the value that we want to search for. In this case, we're going to use community and art, and then it goes back and fetches the data, and it is a little bit more readable this time, not just one kind of continuous string. Now at least we have some row changes there, so it's easier to read. So right away we can see that we found some sessions that we were looking for based on our keywords. And this way we have built a full application where we have our data in our SQL database. In Fabric, we put in some stored procedures, which we then used as a base for GraphQL. So it's not just limited to using a table or a view, but actually it could also be a stored procedure, as you saw in this particular sample. Any last words, Michael, that you would have for our listeners before we start closing? Let's also see if we have any questions that have been passed on to us.
I just again want to say that it is one of my favorite topics, GraphQL. My background is from the dev side, and really I think it will be interesting for different people from different areas of expertise. You can check also in Microsoft Learn information and documentation that is shared, and just try it and you will see how easy is it, and maybe you will be never go back to traditional implementation of GraphQL server.
Very, very true. I think it's very, very exciting how it's making all of this for the developer. And if you at the moment don't have any questions, that's also okay. There is many resources here at the link on this slide that you can go to, and you can look through those resources. And there is also a link in the ticker on the bottom of the screen that you can then use to put your questions in later on, and you will be gotten back to then as well. So, of course, this series isn't quite over yet. There is still more sessions to come in the next days. Actually, the next session will already be tomorrow, and I am really, really excited for that myself. It is Application Lifecycle Management with SQL Database in Fabric, because who doesn't love DevOps topics? And I will probably join in to listen that particular session myself. And of course, we want to remind you one more time that there is the FabCon coming up in March, April next year, and there is the discount code for you that you can use to be able to get a little bit of a better price to attend. So I really encourage you to check out the register link and see if you are able to go there. But with that, I believe we are coming to the end of the session. It was so much fun, Michal, and I also learned a lot on the way. We will probably meet again, and it was really, really fun to present with you.
Pleasure is absolutely from my side, and I hope attendees also will have some interesting information. We will be happy to discuss topics also later. I think it will be not problem to find us in social networks, and yes, we can discuss. Really, Microsoft Fabric is staying amazing platform. There are very important features for everyone in IT industry, and it will be something that will change the whole industry during the next years.
Yes, very exciting times to see where it evolves. So hope you learned something and hope you enjoyed this session, and make sure to leverage all the resources that were provided. And I hope you all a good day, and you can join the next session tomorrow already. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Have a nice day.